Hi YouTube subscribers, this is another special YouTube only clip while Cape Town Television synchronizes with me, and we have all episodes running together from next week onwards. Tonight on Cape Town TV you'll see that great interview with Dave Duarte if you haven't already seen it. Trends analyst talking about interesting developments in technology, spirituality and the future. So give it a watch, still happening out there. And next week we'll be back up with something brand new, both here and on Cape Town TV, of course. So in the meanwhile, while I've got these 5 minutes with you and everyone else is catching up and synchronizing their watches, I thought this would be a great opportunity to ask two questions, one of which is from a viewer and one of which is from everyone else on the internet, really. So it's Astrology 101 just for today. So I'm going to start with your question, Marilyn, because it was such an important question that you asked after the last month ahead episode last month. And that is, for people not living in the southern hemisphere, which is obviously where I do my work, do the month ahead predictions still apply? Indeed, for people not living in Cape Town, even if you are living elsewhere in the southern hemisphere, do those month ahead predictions still apply? Well, it's a great question because, Marilyn, you probably know that astrologers very much take into account the place when we do our calculations. But the good news is that when we do large-scale calculations like that, we have techniques depending on the size of the audience. I could do specific little predictions for Cape Town if I wanted to, but mostly the methods we use for the large movements and trends in society and politics and our everyday human lives, the kind of stuff we touch on in the month ahead predictions, does not depend on place. So it doesn't matter where you are, southern or northern hemisphere, the trends and cycles that are looked at in the month ahead can work for you too. Remember, of course, astrologers are not making the claim that 1/12 of people all go through the same thing, but rather that all of us on Earth are subject to similar cycles and forces of nature, the times that we live in. All of those things affect all 7 billion of us on the planet. And an astrologer's job is really to understand how those effects can be understood with different people according to how different people's personalities work. And that's really what we're doing in the month ahead. So it's always useful to you, no matter where on the planet you are, you will find that it still has relevance for what's happening in your life in some way. So keep watching that. And we've got a new month ahead episode coming up in just 2 weeks' time. So that's another one to look out for. The other question, if you haven't heard it by now, and if you have heard the answer to it by now, apologies for that, but that's the, is it true that my star sign has changed? Did NASA change the star signs or the zodiac or something like that? Well, firstly, of course, NASA have nothing to do with astronomy, astrology, star signs and zodiacs or anything else. They are a space exploration agency, and their job is to build rockets and shoot them out into space, not to name stars or do any of those kinds of things. So that was just a little bit of ridiculousness thrown in. But more importantly, of course, the zodiac has not changed and really will never change because it's an entirely human construct. So no matter how much people peer into space, you might be amazed to know that it's an entirely human construct. And the appearance of the constellation of Ophiuchus that is spoken about in that fake news going around is nothing new either. So here's what actually happened. A couple of thousand years ago, people started observing the relationship between the movement of planets in the sky and what was going on Earth. So we know that they were really observing cycles and they were measuring them using the planets. But they saw it as a cause-effect relationship between the planets and Earth, not really how we see it nowadays. But the end result is the same. We can measure developments here on Earth by looking at the timing and the steps in that cycle out there in space, because they're reliable cycles that just go round and round again, like the clock on your wall. As they improved their ability to measure those cycles, astrologers needed to say where the planets were. They couldn't just say, oh, when it's about halfway through its cycle. These are great big long cycles. So they needed to pin down positions in the sky. So they devised the constellations. They grouped the stars, gave them names that helped them understand the results of when planets in their cycles were in that position relative to the beginning. They didn't think the constellations were causing anything to happen. They named the constellations themselves and told their stories and embedded our human experience and our human history into their description of those constellations, and became one of the earliest records of that long mythological and cultural tradition that plays itself out in our lives to this very day. We know that we play out the human myths and the human archetypes relentlessly in every generation forever. And that's one of the reasons why astrology works so well, because it looks at those human cycles and human experiences in a cyclical way in relation to time, another way that we experience things. So then they used those constellations to do that. But by about 150 BC, it became apparent that it wasn't a reliable way to do things, because by about 150 BC, Greek astronomers had noticed that the positions of the stars wasn't stable, that they were gradually drifting, an effect that we now know is caused by the wobble of the Earth. So they came up with a much better plan that in fact suited better what astrology was doing. And that is, they devised a zodiac, entirely imaginary, based on the position of the sun in its cycle. Now, the sun in its cycle doesn't change. It's reliably the same over and over and over again, because the relationship between the sun and the earth doesn't change. What we call the sun cycle is really the relationship between the sun and the earth. That's not going to change. Well, I hope not. But anyway, as far as we know, that doesn't change until, the world ends. So using that cycle, they divided up the sky again into 12 different positions, so that they were always able to say, it's over there, it's over there, it's over there. And over there was called Aries, and over there was called Gemini, after the constellations, which they had also named in the generations before them. Because what they knew is that in the first stage of a cycle, something acts with a lot of force and initiative. The ancient people said that's like a ram, and they called that position in the sky Aries when they saw it as constellations. So even though constellations of stars were no longer involved, astronomers and astrologers, as they were the same thing really, in 150 BC knew that the first position in the cycle is the initiative phase. So let's call that first position of the sun's space in the sky Aries. It never changes. It's always the first 30 degrees of the sun's movement from the first day of spring. So thus the zodiac signs were named for the constellations, but they improved on them enormously. Firstly, they don't move. And secondly, because they are entirely imaginary, well, I guess the constellations are too, but you don't have to relate them to any stars, they could be divided much more mathematically. So the zodiac signs are all equal in size, which resembles what we would expect from a mathematical cycle that they were measuring, of the same cycle repeating itself year after year. And so the zodiac as we know it was born, and after about 100 to 150 years had become completely standard. The other zodiac, in a form, the original one, in a form, is still occasionally used by Western astrologers and is generally used by Eastern astrologers. But what do I mean by inner form? Well, even that zodiac was improved by the new mathematical way of measuring, although that zodiac still does move. So astrology, as I talk about it, and is largely practiced in the West, uses the imaginary zodiac that we call the tropical zodiac, that was born at around about 150 BC and has been in use for over 2,000 years, unchanging because it can't change. It's like saying if you have a ruler that is 30 centimeters long and has markings that say 30 centimeters or 12 inches for those of you in some places in the northern hemisphere, well, nothing you can do can change that ruler. You can leave it on the table for 1,000,000 years and come back and it'll still have the numbers 0 to 30, a little bit dusty. but it'll still have those numbers 0 to 30 on it. That's exactly what the zodiac is. It's a measuring tool projected onto the sky, made up by human beings, that allows us to state where planets are. Just like we could use a ruler or a protractor for exactly the same kind of purpose here on Earth. And that's why the zodiac is such a beautiful invention and such a smart one, because it allows us to understand the mathematics of cycles and the relationship between ourselves and the cosmos without having to worry about any changes that happen in astronomical observations. Even if NASA did care about astronomy and spoke about constellations, it wouldn't be relevant. Let's face it, that constellation Ophiuchus is real. Of course, it's always been there. People invented it back when they invented the other, well, nowadays we'd say 87 constellations. We settled on 88 constellations in the 20th century. There were many more before that. But Ophiuchus was invented back when they all were invented, and it was always there. And it was always sitting in the position where the sun goes around. But it didn't fit into the division by 12 because the division by 12 is imaginary. It doesn't depend on what stars are really there. So, in a nutshell, there is no 13th sign. Signs are not constellations. They are artificial divisions of the sky that let us measure the relative positions of planets, and the positions of planets is really what astrologers care about, not really the positions of stars and constellations. So your sign is what it always has been, and if you go to sleep like Rip Van Winkle for 1,000,000 years and wake up, the sky will probably be unrecognizable in terms of shifting around and spinning around, but the planets will still be there, and therefore the zodiac will be there exactly like it always was, as long as the seasons are there. I mean, the climate might be changing, but the seasons are still the seasons. They are these quarters of the year. So, good news, your sign is your sign. NASA are back up to their own business, and you can trust that the same nonsense will be spread on the internet year after year. It used to be every a decade or so in newspapers that same story came up. I mean, I've been practicing astrology since 1989 professionally, and have seen that identical story frequently since then. Just wasn't blamed on NASA before they find someone else to attach it to. And nowadays, in the world of Facebook and the general seeming dumbing down of everyone, and where everyone seems to really want to believe anything, that kind of news spreads like a virus, and why astrologers actually have to stand up and explain to people. But it's a great opportunity to remind us what is our connection. Our connection is not really with stars and arbitrary namings of stars. Our connection is with our own earthly human experience and history and ancestry, our myths, our stories, our spirituality, our own thousands of years long story of living on this planet and learning from each other's stories. Ancient astrologers invented an unchangeable zodiac to measure the planetary cycles so that we can share our stories and learn from each other's experience and stories. That hasn't changed. Stick to the story you were born with. It's going to take you through life. See you next week with another brand new episode here on YouTube on Cape Town Television at 7:30 p.m. Remember, if you've got personal questions about something happening in your life, you can always email me with them or visit my website. You can also use that to make a private consultation booking with me or learn about anything else I do. And of course, if you've got Astrology 101 questions or anything that you might think I know something about 101 questions, I'll do my best to help you. See you here next week. Thanks, everyone.